I was a huge sports fan growing up, which meant during the summers, I would always go to different basketball camps. And inevitably, one of the first things they would always start with were simple layup drills. In other words, they started with the basics of like foundations of footwork and coordination. Now, for some of those kids, this is probably pretty irritating because they were probably thinking like, come on, like let's get on with some of the shooting drills. Like let's get on with like doing some 360s in the air and trying to make shots or any number of those types of things. But the reality was those things, those other things were useless if you didn't have the foundations down. And I think when it comes to living out our faith, we can be a little bit like those kids at basketball camp, right? I wonder if we can take something like the gospel and say, yeah, I know that, but that's for the amateurs. Like, let's move on to something a little more advanced for people like me. Well, I'm confident that we're going to discover today and throughout this week, like that is a huge mistake when it comes to living out our faith. As we're going to see all over our passage this week and all over the Bible, that the gospel is not just the ABCs of the faith. It is the A to Z of our faith. So we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 15 as we continue our series, Chaos in Corinth. And here's how verse 1 reads. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. Notice that Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel. So clearly this lets us know that Paul has previously taught them the gospel, but that he has found it necessary in order to remind them, in order to help them stand firm, to have firm footing. Right? This is so telling for us because this is a church that are operating in spiritual gifts and things of that nature, and yet they still, in some ways, lacked a good grasp of the gospel, and this was hurting them. So the church of Corinth, had teachers, false teachers, seeking to really infiltrate the church with a false gospel, and that was making some wobble in their faith. The reality is the gospel is always under attack. Right? We are constantly bombarded by all sorts of messages that seek to undermine the power of the gospel in our lives. We are constantly exposed to messages that make us think we need to earn God's love or favor, or that we become stepchildren if we mess up until we can work our way back, or the better we perform, the more highly God thinks of us, and on we can go. But all of these have a common threat to the gospel. They put the emphasis upon us rather than the emphasis upon God. Paul goes on to define the gospel in this chapter as Christ's death and resurrection. Now, while we could certainly expound upon that definition in other places, within chapter 15, this is a context that Paul is defining the gospel, or this good news. And it's amazing when we just get those two things right, how many things will naturally fall into place. So I want to leave you with this one question to think about, which will be helpful as we go throughout the rest of this week. In what aspect of your faith are you putting the emphasis upon yourself rather than on what God has done for you?